It's not uncommon to hear half-joking references to the burden of bearing Catholic guilt. Perhaps you yourself have made a joke about feeling impelled to do something out of this sense of Catholic guilt. This term comes from an unfortunately common caricature of our religion as one that is psychologically invasive and oppressive. This caricature comes from the work of early psychologists like Sigmund Freud, who believed it was the psychologist's task to liberate the Western mind and heart from the strictures, the constraints of Judaism, Christianity, but most especially the Catholic Church. If we could get the Catholic out of our heads and hearts, so these thinkers thought, we would be free from guilt, free and peaceful with our desires and drives. The evident personal and social breakdown that follows from the denial of sin and guilt has done much to discredit this line of thinking. Nobody really takes Sigmund Freud as a scientist very seriously anymore. On the contrary, psychologists today have come around to the importance of guilt in our lives. Guilt can be an authentic recognition and response to something that we have done that is wrong. And not to feel guilty is to have a malfunction in our hearts and in our heads. This new appreciation for guilt, however, has to be qualified, because it's very, very important to distinguish guilt from something with which it is often confused, something that is, in fact, toxic. And that something is shame. There is a big difference between guilt, which can be good, and shame, which is almost always bad. What is this difference, you may ask? We see the difference between guilt and shame vividly portrayed in the gospel we just heard. In it, we find a woman caught in the very act of adultery. To the extent that this woman recognized that what she did was wrong, she experienced guilt. And this guilt was authentic. It grasped something true. However, the fact that she was caught committing this immoral act by a crowd of men, scribes and Pharisees, exposed her to shame. Being viewed, being judged as deficient, as lacking by other people, by the world, this is the heart of shame. And shame distracts us from God. It distracts us from the one that we are called to look up to when we have done wrong. The scribes and the Pharisees probably thought that they were performing a necessary moralistic police action when they rounded this poor woman up and condemned her. Adultery, after all, is bad. We should discourage adultery. And what better way of discouraging adultery than publicly shaming adulterers? This seems like a sound policy. The only problem with it is that it lives out of rank hypocrisy. And the Lord Jesus shows us what he thinks of shame by the way he engages that condemning crowd. He dismisses them. He silences them. He sends them away. Why? So that this woman who did wrong might be alone with him, might be alone with God, whom we ultimately offend in every sin. And when this woman finally, with some peace and quiet, looked up at Jesus, she did not find condemnation. Rather, she found an offer of reconciliation. She found mercy. This is what shame makes possible if, and only if, we lift up our eyes and hearts to God, and in acknowledging our guilt, then receive his mercy. Shame distracts us from that. Shame consumes us in what other people think and gets us nowhere. I would bet no one in this church today has ever been in a situation exactly like the woman caught in adultery. Thankfully, we don't live in a place where people are rounded up and publicly punished. However, there's an online version of this that is prevalent enough, when people gang up and throw metaphorical stones at people who fall short of their standards. And we don't need a physical crowd gathered around us to experience shame. Very often we hear the voice of the world in our own hearts, condemning us when we've fallen short of some expectation. We can be consumed by fear that we will be found out, that people will know that we're not perfect, that we do wrong, that we're not as good at our jobs as maybe appears on the surface. When we feel shame, we are invited to call out to the Lord Jesus, to ask him to send those voices away, to silence them, so that we can be alone with him, so that we can lift up our eyes to him, and after acknowledging our guilt, find in him our pardon and our peace.